to make the ultimate wet pallet, what it is, why you might need it, and why you should make your own. Okay, so hello and welcome to Model Kit Stuff. Today I'm going to show you how I make my ultimate wet pallet. Let's start with what is a wet pallet and why you might need one. Well, a wet pallet is basically a device that allows you to keep paint for longer whilst it's in use. So rather than it going dry in your pallet, you can seal this up and it allows you to have the paint wet and usable for several days maybe. Why might you need one? I generally don't use them very often at all, if I'm honest, but that's because I don't do a lot of figure and diorama painting. If you do though, these are really handy, because if you're working on several figures that might be in similar or the same uniform, for example, or you're doing, let's say you're doing a famo and you've got 8 figures that need to be painted to sit on that famo truck, and you need to paint all of their faces and hands, and that's going to take you several days with different shades and different mixing. That's when a wet palette is really helpful. Now, you're not looking at a wet palette right now, you're looking at a Tupperware box, but I will explain all when I show you how to put it together. So what it means is that you can extend your painting time over several days and keep that session going with the same paints that you mixed originally, so you've got complete continuity of your painting while you work. So it's very handy, particularly if you're doing volume. Like I say, I don't use it very often. In fact, I've dug this out of the attic, ready for a project that's going to be coming up, actually probably the back end of the year, but it seemed like a good time to clean this up and redo it and show you guys what I do. Now, there are quite a lot of different wet palettes on the market in the recent 18-24 months. A couple of companies brought some out, and then a load of companies have jumped on the bandwagon. And they're not overly expensive, but here's why you should make your own. Firstly, it's still cheaper than buying a manufactured one. And secondly, the real cost in a wet pallet is not the initial purchase, it's the constant replacing of the elements inside the wet pallet. So if you build your own, you will save yourself many pounds and dollars. It's just the way to go. Okay, so let's start with the actual container. So the container itself is quite important. I've come across a couple of videos, and I haven't really gone out and watched wet palette how-to videos, but I've come across a couple of videos that have popped up in my watch stream because I'm watching those channels. And the first mistake that a lot of people make is get the wrong container. So let me show you what's important about the container. What's important about the container is the lid, not the base. Why? Because you're building your wet palette in the lid. If you build your wet palette in the base, it's harder to get at. So actually, we're going to turn this upside down, and this is going to be your lid. And that means that your fastening system needs to be on the base, not, as in most cases, most companies make the hinge, the locking hinge, on the lid. So this brand don't. The lid is always completely free of the hinge mechanism. So I would recommend looking for this. Now, it comes in all sorts of different sizes, but what you really want is the one that is the most shallow, because it's taking up least space. And if you look at the ones that you can buy, the pre-made ones, they're quite thin. They're often a bit thinner than this. So that's the first thing. What we're going to do is we're going to build our wet pallet in the lid. That means when you're using it, you've got a lot more access to it. The edges aren't getting in the way. It's a small difference, but believe me, when you're using it, it's a big difference. Can you imagine if you were using an ordinary pallet and it had a lip on? You know, if there was an edge that deep all the way around, it would be more restrictive, and it's exactly the same. So we start building our wet pallet with the lid, and this is simply going to be used for sealing it when it's done. So what we need next is some sponge in the bottom. So these are really cheap. You'll find them on the cleaning aisle. They come in packs. This one was a pack of 4. They're not at all expensive, and what you get is a fairly shallow sponge, and you know, it's exactly what you need. This is one that I've made damp, and that's your next thing that you need to do before you fit this, is make it damp, because obviously it's going to swell, and you can see there is a little bit of difference in size once you've made it damp. So I've basically run this under the tap, wrung it out so it's damp, not wet. So that's what you need to do, and then you can cut it so that it fits tightly into your base. So let's do that. I'm actually going to straighten this edge up, and we can do that using, so I'm going to use my grid to try and give me a sort of a straighter line. You won't be able to cut this with a knife, and it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, because this is not the surface your paint's going to go on. There we go. And then what we need to do is fold it into the edge, make a estimated cut. Just check that that's okay. Yeah. So now we can trim that other side up. So if I get that on there, that's about right. Doesn't have to be exact. So what the sponge is going to do is it's going to contain the moisture that makes your palette a wet palette. Okay, there we go. Now you can see there's a gap at the top. That's fine. We need a gap at the top. I'm going to show you how to make a wet palette that's slightly beyond most wet palettes in terms of usability. So next thing that I want to actually do is straighten up these two edges a little bit. So I'm just going to, okay, so I've cut my sponge down to size. Perfect, that is ideal. Okay, so what we're going to put on top of this is baking parchment. Now these days a lot of baking parchment is silicone coated, and you don't want the silicone coated because it's not going to absorb the water. So what you need is something that's going to absorb the water. So you could use really thick, you can use blotting paper, or you could use really thick kitchen towel, but this stuff lasts longer and it doesn't dissolve and break up like paper does. So this is much better, and this is the bit that's going to save you so much money, because on the manufactured branded wet palettes, you're constantly replacing this, and you're buying 8 or 10 sheets for several pounds at a time. I'm probably never going to buy another roll of this. So that's the next thing we need to do, and what we want to do is make sure that we've got enough to cover the whole distance and just the depth of the palette, so we can hold it in place on both sides. so a little bit longer than your sponge. So I'm going to cut that up and show you that in place. Okay, so that's my top sheet of my wet pallet cut out, and you can see I've hacked it. I've hacked it out of the piece, and I'm going to get two refills out of that one section. So I've got double this, so this will last me more than my lifetime, definitely. Take this to the afterlife with me. The next thing that you won't have seen before in a wet pallet, probably, is you need some packing sponge. This is the sort of stuff that comes around white goods, TVs, that sort of stuff. So it needs to be sponge, not polystyrene. Polystyrene goes mouldy, but yeah, a little bit of packing sponge. And what we want to do is cut that so that it will fill this gap, and then I'll show you what we're going to do with it. So what we need to do is cut it so that it fits the gap, and we've got the rounded corners there, and it holds everything nice and tight. So it's basically acting as it's going to put a little bit of pressure on the sponge, and that's going to do two things. It's going to stop everything moving around and keep everything nice and tidy and tight, and it's also going to just put a bit of pressure on the sponge, which is going to make sure that the moisture in the sponge is being pushed up to the surface a little bit, which is handy. So I'm going to cut that up and show you what that looks like. I'm going to use probably my large knife. Now, in terms of depth, because this is a bit deeper than we want, you've got to remember that you're putting a lid on it. So let me cut you the size and then we'll show you the depth. Okay, I've cut our sponge. What we need to do now is get the height right, and the height needs to be around about 30 millimeters, thereabouts. It's not by any means an exact science, so all 1 1/4 inches. So I'm going to cut that and thin that out, so let's just mark that up. There you go, 30. Do 30 at this end. There we go. Don't throw that away. That's useful for all sorts of things. You wouldn't believe the uses for packing sponges. I use them a lot for making holders for all sorts of stuff. Okay, that is our sponge insert. And what we're going to do is we're just going to tuck in the sides, put our sponge insert in, and you can see what that is doing immediately. It's holding that into place. Now that's popping up a little bit, which means we're a little bit oversized, so I'm just going to trim a little bit off the end there. What's important is it doesn't overlap the closing of the lid, because that's intrinsic to keeping your wet pallet wet. You'll see I didn't measure that, I just went for it. There we go. Okay, so that is acting as a little stopper there that's, like I say, putting a little bit, just gentle pressure on the sponge. It's holding our top paper nice and tight, so we've not got any issues with it moving about. What we do is we make our sponge moist before we put the top paper on, and that gives us our wet pallet. So what's this for? Well, this is perfect for a paintbrush stand. So what we're going to do is make a paintbrush stand using a knife and some paintbrushes. Now obviously paintbrushes can come in different size handles, so you need to be able to accommodate whatever you're likely to be using. So just doing a little cross in there. Make sure it's deep enough for the brush to go down. There you go, you can see. So I'm going to populate that for you and then I'll come back. So I've finished and you can see I've created space for a pipette, a cotton swab, some toothpicks, cocktail sticks and paintbrushes. You can customize that to whatever you use when you're painting figures or likely to be using your wet palette. And then when you want to put paint on it, you're putting your paint in an area here, and the moisture that's keeping this damp is going to stop that or slow down the drying time dramatically. Now my tip is, if when you're coming back to it you want to put the lid on, obviously we've got to take all this out, you're not going to keep this in. This you're putting in as you're using it. So at the end of your session, when your paint is still wet and you still want to preserve it, what you're going to do is you're going to put the lid on and seal it. So this is pressing down now into the rubber seal, so that is completely sealed. You can keep it flat, as you can see. I mean, I can actually turn it upside down, it doesn't drop out. That's because that is keeping that in place. And then put it in the fridge. Keep it in the fridge, and that palette will stay for several days if needs be. When you've finished using it and you've ended your session and you know that you're not going to be wanting to use your palette for a little while, chuck your paper away, let the sponge dry out so that you don't get any mildew building up in the palette, air dry everything, and then put it all back in until the next time you use it. So there you go, my ultimate wet palette how-to guide. I hope that was useful. You now know how I make my ultimate wet palette. Thanks for looking in. You take care, enjoy your modelling, and I'll see you very soon.